Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In this episode I will cover the case of Styllou Christofi, who was the penultimate woman to hang in England, although she received very little media interest, despite the fact that her crime was arguably more brutal and sensational than that committed by Ruth Ellis, the final woman to go to the noose 6 months later. Regarding the lack of coverage Styllou Christofi's case received, Albert Pierrepoint would state in his autobiography, "There had been no great outcry at all." Comparing her to Ruth Ellis, he continued by saying Christofi, quote, had not been a blonde nightclub hostess, but a grey-haired and bewildered grandmother who spoke no English, only the language of the tears that were on her cheek when I came to her. Join me as I delve into the case of Styllou Christofi, a true mother-in-law from hell. Hella Bleacher was a beautiful, fair-skinned, almond-eyed girl, with a big smile and dark locks of hair. Her attractive looks had made her successful as a model in her homeland of Germany, and by 1939 the 21-year-old had planned to travel to the United States in order to continue her career. With the intention of having a brief stopover in London before heading stateside, Hella would find her plans scuppered by external forces when the outbreak of the Second World War forced her to remain in England. Although there is no record of this occurring, it is possible that as a German national, Hella may have been among the approximately 80,000 individuals who were considered to be enemy aliens. Unlike John Christie's first victim, Ruth First, Hella may have been sent to an internment camp and summoned to a hearing to determine whether she had hostile sympathies. 3 years into the war, Hella had experienced the blackouts, the bombings, and the screeching of the air raid sirens, summoning people to scurry to shelter, huddled into cramped conditions while explosions echoed and sent tremors through the ground. She would have walked past the ruins of blitz-damaged buildings and seen the effects of the war on those around her, while also wondering what was happening to those she had left behind in Germany. With her ambition to head to America stalled and no hopes of returning to her native country, Hella adjusted to a new life in London, gaining employment in a clothing store and finding love with 19-year-old Styllou Christofi, a Greek Cypriot who had come to England in 1937 with the intention of starting a new life. He too had settled into the capital and would get work as an insurance agent and a sommelier at the Café de Paris. Having met in 1941, the pair married the following year and welcomed their first child, Nicholas, who was joined 2 years later by a little brother Peter and a younger sister Stella, who arrived in 1946. Accompanied by their 3 young children, the couple moved into a 2-bedroom ground-floor flat in South Hill Park, London, just a short walk from the 800-acre Hampstead Heath, where the family probably spent warm summer days enjoying walks, while the children played on the vast green spaces. The family lived happily for 11 years, and in 1953 they were joined by Stavros's mother, Styllou, who had travelled from her small village in Cyprus and moved in with her son. The 52-year-old planned to find work in England, the money from which she hoped to use to purchase land back in Cyprus. London must have seemed like an alien landscape to Styllou, who was born and raised in a rural Cypriot village, where traditions were deeply ingrained and family was paramount. Arriving from her home, where mud tracks were carved with donkey-drawn carts, and many earned a living off the land, the English capital had a different type of harshness to it, a labyrinth of brick and stone-built buildings, looming over the crowded streets, where automobiles had taken the place of horse-drawn carriages, while the colder climate brought a chill to her weathered skin. Not only was the city an overwhelming experience, but Styllou was confronted with the stark differences in how people went about their daily lives. Women going to work, socialising in pubs and bars, all the while wearing clothes that in Styllou's mind were far from modest. Back in her village there was a clear distinction between the duties of a man and a woman. The former provided for their families, while the women stayed at home, caring for the children, making the meals, mending the clothes, and assisting her husband. Family life was at the heart of everything. Elders were respected, children were seen as a blessing to be nurtured and raised with a strong morals and an understanding of their culture and traditions. In these rural communities, major moments such as weddings were held in high esteem, with them being a cause for celebration for the whole village. When a wedding was to be held in rural Cyprus, there were certain expectations that had to be abided by. First, there would be a formal meeting between the bride's parents and the groom's, and only after this would the family of the bride opt to give their permission for the union to go ahead. They would then set out their terms, with a discussion of the dowry also taking place, although this dowry may consist of livestock or the stipulation that the groom's family covered the cost of the wedding. The parents of the couple would oversee the arrangements of the ceremony, and the events would be celebrated by the entire village as they embraced the start of the couple's new life together. Stavros, however, had forgone this tradition when he chose to marry in London without his mother's input to a woman Styllou had never met and would soon disapprove of. The first issue Styllou and Hella encountered was their inability to understand each other, with the mother-in-law only able to converse in her native tongue, of which Hella only knew a few phrases. But for Styllou, there were bigger issues. She disapproved of the manner in which Hella dressed, with her fashionable attire lacking modesty, and more disdain came when Styllou learned that her daughter-in-law worked in a clothing shop, rather than focusing on raising her children and tending to the home, both of which Styllou believed Hella was also doing wrong. The 52-year-old picked fault at how Hella maintained her home, and was alarmed that the 3 children were not being raised in the traditional Cypriot way. Needless to say, her disapproval of her son's wife made for an uncomfortable home life, with the tensions mounting throughout the year. These disagreements led to Styllou moving out of the home on 3 separate occasions, and when she did move back in with the family, she shared a room with her grandsons and interfered in the running of the house. For a year, Styllou continued to be disdainful of both Hella and London. She made her daughter-in-law's life unbearable, berating her and undermining her choices at every turn, causing arguments between Stavros and his wife. Unable to put up with this situation any longer, Hella realised she needed a break, and decided she would return to Germany in the middle of August. Unwilling to leave her children unsupervised with her mother-in-law, Hella chose to take them with her, strongly insisting that Styllou moved back to Cyprus before she returned from the trip. On the evening of July the 29th, 1954, 2 weeks prior to Hella's planned excursion, Stavros kissed his wife on the front steps of their home before heading off to make the 40-minute journey to the centre of London, where he would start his shift at the Café de Paris. He was unaware that only a few hours later, his mother would be found in the middle of the street making a frantic plea for help. At 1 a.m. on that warm summer's night, Styllou rushed out into the road, forcing an approaching car to come to a halt, and in broken English she pleaded for the occupant, quote, "Please come, fire burning, children sleeping." Fearing that there were children in danger, the couple in the car, Mr. and Mrs. Burstoff, rushed to assist the woman, who led them into the ground floor flat and out into the yard at the rear of the property. There they were confronted by a badly charred figure. They asked Styllou who the individual was, to which she replied, "My son married German girl. He liked plenty clothes, plenty shoes, babies going to Germany." Once the emergency services arrived, attempts were made to extinguish the remnants of the fire, although it quickly became apparent that the burned individual was beyond aid, and so an investigation into the death was begun. The identity of the deceased was established, and during an initial interaction with Styllou, she told police, quote, "I wake up, smell burning, go downstairs, Hella burning. Throw water, touch her face, not move. Run out, get help." Given this statement, the police had to discern whether the death was an accident. Perhaps Hella's clothing had come into contact with an exposed flame, and in desperation she had fled outside to call for help. Or had her death been caused by a third party? And if so, what was the motive? A closer inspection of the scene and the body would yield a number of clues. The theory that Hella's death had been an accident was quickly dispelled, when it was noted that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and despite the burns to her body, ligature marks were present on Hella's neck. It was also noted that the victim was partially dressed, and her wedding ring was missing. Proceeding into the home, investigators found blood within the kitchen, suggesting that this was possibly where Hella was first attacked. But with her mother-in-law claiming she had been woken by the smell of smoke, police had to consider the possibility that the killer had come from outside the home. As a key witness, Styllou was taken to the police station for questioning, yet due to her being illiterate and unable to fully comprehend English, a translator would be required, and while one was sent for, the investigators proceeded with questioning Styllou, while her son Stavros acted as her translator. During her initial statement, Styllou maintained that she had been in bed when she was roused by the smell of smoke. Going to investigate, she found her daughter-in-law on fire in the rear garden. Styllou alleged she attempted to put out the fire but failed, and that's when she rushed into the street for help. But her claims of innocence would slowly unravel. Firstly, the post-mortem examination would confirm that Hella had been struck over the head by a heavy object, with the force of the blow rendering the 36-year-old unconscious. This linked to the blood found in the kitchen, and particularly on an ashpan, which was determined to have been the item used in the attack. Further evidence showed that once Hella had been incapacitated, her assailant had proceeded to strangle her using a ligature, later identified as a scarf that had been found at the scene, charred, cut in two, with a knot in one section. This had belonged to Styllou's eldest grandson. With Hella deceased, her assailant had then dragged her body into the yard, where it was doused in paraffin before being set on fire. Still considering the possibility that the crime had been committed by an intruder, who had potentially stolen the victim's jewellery, the police inquiry extended to questioning residents who dwelt in the vicinity of the Christofi home. They hoped to discover whether there had been any unusual activities on the night of the murder. These inquiries, however, led police to suspect that the killer had been closer to home, when witnesses began to describe the fraught relationship between Styllou and Hella. Yet it was the testimony of John Byers-Young that would lead police to suspect the mother-in-law of the crime. As a neighbour of the family, not only had John been aware of the tension in the house, but he also had a clear view of the yard to the rear of the Christofi's flat. He told police, and later the court, that on the 29th of July he had gone into his garden with his dog and noticed something burning in the neighbouring yard, which he believed was, quote, a wax model lying in the fire. John understood that Hella worked in a clothing store and came to the conclusion that it was simply a mannequin. John continued to state that he also observed Styllou in the garden that night, advising the court that, quote, she came right into the area, bent over the body, and gave me the impression that she was about to stir the fire up. The fire was dying down. Having recognised the accused, I thought all was in order, and I returned to my garden and then my house. This account contradicted Styllou's claim that she had been in bed, and was only aware of the fire when she smelt smoke. As the focus closed in on Styllou, a thorough inspection of the family home uncovered crucial evidence. Starting in the kitchen, it became clear that an attempt had been made to clean up blood from the kitchen floor and the table legs. The culprit had failed to remove all traces, particularly on a bucket, which still had residual staining on its bottom and side. This bucket also provided some key articles, including some women's clothing which had been soaked in detergent. The investigators also seized a pair of women's shoes, which were heavily blood-stained, with the soles saturated with paraffin. And a search of the room Styllou shared with her grandson would not only reveal that Styllou had not slept in her bed that night, but it would unearth Hella's missing wedding ring. This had been wrapped in paper and concealed in an ornament on the mantelpiece. These discoveries all but eliminated the possibility that an unknown intruder had carried out the crime. With investigators now certain that they had found their suspect, they formally charged Styllou with murder less than 48 hours after her daughter-in-law's death. When confronted regarding their suspicions that Styllou had hit her daughter-in-law over the head with an ash plate, strangled her, then dragged her body into the yard where the accused then set the remains on fire, Styllou failed to provide any convincing explanations for what had occurred that night. She continued to plead her innocence, telling Detective Superintendent Leonard Crawford, quote, "I did not make use of any petrol, but some few days previously some petrol spilled on the floor. I did not pay any attention to it. I stepped on it, and probably the smell was the result of that petrol. From this story, I know nothing more." Appearing in court for her remand hearing on the 4th of August 1954, Styllou was assisted by an interpreter, and her situation as a foreigner with little income was highlighted by a Cypriot barrister, Mr. Rustomji, who stated, "I appear for this poor, unfortunate, illiterate woman, who is a stranger in our midst. She is a native of Cyprus. We would like the hearing to be fixed as soon as possible, so that she can be relieved of all anxiety and suspense." He added that this grandmother is destitute and has no resources at all. She is a stranger in a strange country. This plea by Mr. Rustamji resulted in his client receiving legal aid to pay for her defence, which once again highlighted the difference between how this case was approached by the media in comparison to Ruth Ellis's, whose legal aid was paid by a newspaper in exchange for an exclusive of her life story. During my research, Hella's murder and the subsequent events garnered very little interest from the press, and when newspapers did cover the case, they only dedicated a few lines on less prominent pages for the story. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, being the murder of a mother in such a brutal fashion while her children slept just yards away, and the accused being the victim's mother-in-law, the case continued to generate little interest, even when the trial began at the Old Bailey in October 1954. In his opening statement to the court, prosecutor Mr. Christmas Humphreys described Styllou's actions as a, quote, "stupid murder by a stupid woman of the illiterate, peasant type." He also accused Mrs. Christofi of being jealous of Hella, who had, quote, "youth and pretty clothes," with the 53-year-old mother-in-law also feeling unwanted and resentful at the fact that she was being sent back to Cyprus. In reference to the evidence against the accused, prosecutor Mr. Humphreys added that Mrs. Christofi, quote, "really believed that after washing the floor she could eliminate bloodstains, and that with a small tin of paraffin she could so burn a body that it would not be recognised." Throughout the 4-day trial, Styllou was accompanied by a Greek translator, who helped her to understand the proceedings. But as in her earlier hearings, it was reported that the 53-year-old still appeared bewildered. Her plea of not guilty was overshadowed by the magnitude of evidence against her, none of which she could provide a plausible explanation for, and during the 2 hours she spent on the stand, with every word being translated, Styllou continued with the narrative that she was only aware that Hella was hurt when she found her in the garden. She added to her testimony that she had witnessed 2 men in the property that night, with her claiming, quote, "I saw the front door open. As I was going down the stairs, I saw a man with a suitcase. I was practically down the last step when I saw another man." However, there was nothing to back up her claims, and the evidence against Styllou left the jury of 10 men and 2 women in no doubt that the 53-year-old was guilty of murder. And so, on Thursday the 28th of October 1954, Mr. Justice Devlin passed the only sentence available to him, as he condemned Styllou Christofi to death. With her case receiving very little interest, and few having sympathy for the plight of a woman who had murdered her daughter-in-law, Styllou's execution date was set for the 15th of December 1954. Yet new evidence would be brought to light just days prior, which would cause some to question whether the sentence should be carried out. The 50-year-old garnered support from several members of Parliament who believed that the execution should not proceed, not because they believed Styllou was innocent, but because they believed that she had a mental disorder which the jury should have been made aware of during her trial. Amongst those who supported the motion for a reprieve was Sidney Silverman, a vocal supporter for the abolition of the death penalty. He had founded the National Campaign for the abolition of capital punishment and had spoken out regarding the sentences of Timothy Evans and Derek Bentley. Accompanied by a number of other MPs, Mr Silverman and Sir Leslie Plummer hoped to have an audience with the Home Secretary, Mr Lloyd George, regarding the findings of the Holloway prison doctor who had monitored Styllou while she awaited trial. In his report from October 5, 1954, Dr Christie compiled his thoughts on Stylou's mental and physical health, during which he wrote that he and a number of colleagues had observed some concerning behaviour from the prisoner, including her being, quote, hysterical, very distressed, restless, aggressive, sitting in bed screaming, with her 2 stockings twisted in her hands. The doctor continued by stating, "The clinical picture is that of non-systematized delusional mental disorder. This is a recognized disease of the mind. My opinion, the fear that her grandchildren would not be brought up properly induced a defect of reason due to the above disease of the mind. Whereby, however much she may have been capable of appreciating the nature and quality of the acts she was doing, at the time of the acts, the defect of reason was such that she was incapable of knowing that what she was doing was wrong." Dr Christie concluded that, quote, "In my opinion, she is insane, but is medically fit to plead and to stand trial." The gathered MPs conceded that given the doctor's findings, Mrs Christofi had the mental capacity to comprehend the trial proceedings, and had enough understanding to be able to plead. However, they argued, quote, "If she is insane, she cannot be found guilty, and one would have thought could not be executed." They also expressed the belief that the doctor's findings should have been presented at trial, stating, "If that evidence had been before a jury, and had not been contradicted by other evidence or seriously shaken in cross-examination, the jury must have found her guilty but insane. It would emerge that although this information was available to them, the defence did not introduce it at court at the request of Styllou. Even after her son implored her to use the insanity plea, she refused, telling Stavros, 'I am a poor woman of no education, but I am not a mad woman.' The MPs highlighted that this refusal denied her the opportunity to have her mental state be taken into account by the jury. With the belief that the absence of this information was detrimental, the MPs hoped that the Home Secretary would use his discretion to commute the sentence to life in prison. However, despite numerous attempts, they were denied an audience, and Lloyd George refused to grant a reprieve. As stated in previous episodes, the Home Secretary had the power to commute the sentence to life imprisonment, but only on certain grounds, with the person holding the office having to set aside any emotions regarding the case and view it with a clinical perspective. Lloyd George had taken into account Styllou's mental state, and as per the Criminal Lunatic Act of 1884, he had to consult with 3 psychiatrists, all of whom concluded that Christofi was not insane, and they saw no medical reason for a reprieve to be granted. With the criteria for a reprieve not met, the Home Secretary had no option but to allow the sentence to be carried out, and on the 15th of December 1954, Styllou Christofi would be sent to the noose. In the weeks leading up to her execution, her son Stavros visited his mother in prison, still under the impression that she had acted out of madness. He told the Daily Mail on the day of his mother's execution that, quote, "As usual, she would not reason at all. She just shouted, 'Innocent, innocent.' She turned around to say she had forgiven me for what I have done for her being in prison, and that she had nothing to do with the whole thing. She blamed me because she said I was the main witness." She would also write letters to her son, continuing to blame him for her predicament, seemingly unaware or unconcerned by the trauma and heartache she had inflicted on him and her grandchildren. On one occasion she wrote, "I hope that you are all right as well as your children. I hope that you will always be with God's help. It doesn't alter what is going to happen to me. You have tried too hard to hang me, to put around my neck the noose, so that you may rest. I am not obliging you to come to see me, my son. For my fortune, there are my family in the streets of Cyprus, crying for me. If you saw their letters, you would be moved and cry as we do. My brothers say that if the sea were earth, they would come on foot to see me. Kiss the children for me." It was not only his mother's inability to acknowledge her crime and the pain she had inflicted that Stavros was forced to contend with, but he would also learn something about her past, which made him see Styllou in a different light. In the days following the guilty verdict, it would be reported in the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mirror that Styllou Christofi had stood accused of murder in Cyprus 29 years earlier. A crime her son had no knowledge about, except for some comments which he had dismissed as rumours. It all started in 1911, when a woman murdered her husband with the assistance of her lover. This woman had a son, who married a 14-year-old Styllou Christofi, who would come to live with the family on a small olive grove, which was their only source of income. Styllou and her husband would have one child, Stavros, but they lived in poor conditions, under the domineering and critical eye of her mother-in-law, who chastised her for the smallest indiscretion. Ironically, behaviour Styllou would repeat with her own daughter-in-law. Yet in 1924 it would be the mother-in-law who would lose her life. It was claimed that Styllou, alongside 2 accomplices, entered the mother-in-law's home, and while the older woman was being held down by Styllou's co-conspirators, the daughter-in-law inserted a lit torch down her victim's throat. While some speculated that the murder was carried out because Styllou was fed up with her overbearing mother-in-law, others believed she had agreed to do it in revenge for the murder committed in 1911. Regardless of the motive, the case went to trial, yet Styllou and her accomplices were acquitted of the charges against them. However, she would be forced to fend for herself as a single mother when her husband left her alone and destitute. He was unable to forgive his wife's unspeakable act. Being the sole caregiver to Stavros, Styllou formed an intense attachment to him. Perhaps it was her own overbearing nature that forced him to move to England, where he fell in love with Hella, a woman his mother would never have approved of, although it was likely she felt no woman was good enough for her child. Stavros had built a life in London with Hella and their 3 children, yet Styllou destroyed their happiness. Leading Stavros to reflect on his mother's actions, he would later state, "I cannot find it in my heart to forgive my mother. The word mother has become a mockery to me." Just 2 months after Styllou's execution, another murder would take place, which, once again, received little interest, and in this instance, instead of a mother-in-law from hell, it was the case of a nightmare neighbour. 40-year-old Sarah Lloyd had been friends with her 87-year-old neighbour Edith Emsley for a number of years. Yet this all changed in 1953, when an altercation between the pair completely destroyed their relationship. The reason for this disagreement is not known, but for the next 2 years there was an enduring animosity between them. This would take a deadly turn, when on the 7th of February, the slightly built, 5-foot-tall Mrs. Emsley was found on the floor of her scullery with head injuries and burns. The elderly woman would be rushed to Leeds General Infirmary, where doctors fought to save her life, while police started an investigation. Despite the severity of her injuries, Mrs. Emsley was able to name her assailant, with her accusing her neighbour and former friend of the attack. Sarah Lloyd was not at home, however, with the police locating the suspect and her 13-year-old daughter at 9 o'clock that night, as they exited the local cinema. When told about the assault on Mrs. Emsley and her allegations against Sarah, the 40-year-old denied causing her neighbour any injury. Despite her denial, the police brought Mrs. Lloyd in for questioning, and in a written statement she spoke of an anonymous letter which Mrs. Emsley had received regarding an incident involving Mrs. Emsley's son, as well as claims that a brick and a marble had smashed the elderly woman's window. Sarah stated, quote, "Someone put a letter through Mrs. Emsley's letterbox some time ago. She showed the letter to me, and it involved her son and another woman. She said I had written it, or my husband. I denied it. Although it cannot be certain, this may have been the instigating factor in what occurred between the former friends." Sarah's testimony would turn to the attack on Mrs. Emsley, with her stating that, "I will tell you the truth. It has been going on for years. She has called me all sorts of names. She would not be friends with me. Yesterday afternoon, I got out of bed at 3:45. About 10 minutes after, I thought I heard her shouting for help. Went round to her scullery. She was on the floor. I tried to pick her up, but she would not let me, and called me all sorts of names. I don't know what made me do it. I lost my head, picked up the spade, and hit her on the head a lot of times. I seemed to be in a frenzy, and I could not stop." Having confessed to causing Mrs. Emsley's head injuries, officers inquired about the burns the 87-year-old had suffered, but then believing a pan of boiling water had been poured over the victim. Sarah responded to their questions by claiming she couldn't remember what had happened, telling the investigators, quote, "I don't remember. I can remember hitting her with the spade. If that pan went over her head, I don't remember. I might have caught it and knocked it over her head." Sarah Lloyd was initially charged with attempted murder, yet 3 days after the incident, Mrs. Emsley, who was said to be a fit and active woman prior to the attack, passed away, raising the charges to murder. There was little complexity regarding this case. Sarah had been identified as the perpetrator by the victim, and in turn the accused had admitted to the crime. However, she insisted that she did not intend to murder the 87-year-old. The case went to trial on the 5th of May 1955 at Leeds Assizes, with Mr. Justice Devlin, the same judge who had passed sentence on Styllou Christofi, presiding. Acting for the prosecution was Mr. Lyons, whose opening statement strongly highlighted the needless nature of the crime, within stating to the jury, quote, "No degree of acrimony can possibly justify or provide a motive for so vicious and violent an assault as this." The prosecutor proceeded to break down the timeline of events leading up to the crime, advising that the defendant had moved into the home next to Mrs. Emsley 6 years prior, and they initially shared a good relationship, until a disagreement ended their friendship. He went on to detail the ferocity of the assault, and highlighted the fact that the attack had occurred at approximately 4 p.m. on the 7th of February, yet due to Sarah Lloyd leaving the scene, Mrs. Emsley only received medical attention an hour and a half later, when she was found on the floor by her son. Further adding to his portrayal of Sarah Lloyd as a callous individual, Mr. Lyon also advised the jury that following the attack, the 40-year-old went home and cleaned the blood off her person, as evident from a blood-stained towel in her home. The defendant then took her teenage daughter to the cinema, seemingly unconcerned for the well-being of her neighbour. When Mrs. Lloyd took to the stand, she claimed that she had acted in self-defence, with her alleging that Mrs. Emsley had attacked her first, describing how the elderly woman had pulled her to the floor and proceeded to hit her and tried to strangle her. During her testimony, Sarah Lloyd was handed the spade used in the attack, and described how she tried to fight off Mrs. Emsley, managing to reach for the nearest item to defend herself with. She then proceeded to demonstrate how she struck the victim while holding the spade in both hands, with her admitting, quote, "I got rather tired striking the blows, but had to continue." The prime focus of Sarah's defence was to put forth the idea that she had been provoked, and testimony provided by the prison medical officer, Dr. Cormack, seemed to corroborate this claim, with him noting that upon examination, Sarah was found to have a number of bruises located on her chest, arm and legs. With the defence taking the stance that Sarah was provoked into inflicting the injuries Mrs. Emsley had suffered, they argued that the defendant did not intend to cause the 87-year-old's death, with Mr. Waller QC advising the jury that the onus was on them to determine whether his client was guilty of murder or manslaughter. The jury's verdict would be delivered on the 6th of May 1955, with them finding Sarah Lloyd guilty of murder. As he had done at the conclusion of the Christofi trial, Judge Justice Devlin donned the customary black cap and delivered the death sentence. Sarah Lloyd would appeal her sentence, but on Monday the 20th of June, the decision was upheld, and an execution date was set for the 7th of July. with Albert Pierrepoint being summoned to carry out the deed. Yet he would not meet Sarah in the execution chamber, as just 2 days prior to her going to the noose, the Home Secretary would issue a reprieve, commuting her sentence to life in prison. As was standard practice, no reason was given for this decision, meaning one can only speculate, although it was possibly felt that Sarah had acted out of self-defence, and she had not meant to fatally injure Mrs. Emsley. Sarah Lloyd would serve just 7 years before being released from prison. She had been spared from the noose, yet a week after Sarah had been reprieved, another woman would not be so fortunate. Ruth Ellis had committed her crime on the same street on which the Christofi family had lived, and like Styllou, she would meet her death at the hands of Albert Pierrepoint. Join me next time as I delve into the life and crimes of Ruth Ellis, the last woman to hang in England.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.